York Times article in August of 2013. It says, the actor Jim Carrey, a star of the new superhero movie Kick-Ass 2, tweeted that he was distancing himself from the film because in the wake of the Sandy Hook massacre, in all good conscience, he cannot support the movie's extensive and graphically violent scenes. So this leads to show that the correlation between media violence and violence in reality is becoming more clear, and that leads to my proposition, which is that people who are exposed to media violence show higher signs of aggression. And I have 3 claims for this. My first claim is that being witness to violence desensitizes us to violence, and it makes it not such a big deal. My second claim, we'll be using Albert Bandura's social learning theory, which suggests that watching violence teaches it. And my third claim is that social research suggests a line between aggressiveness and violent behavior. So back to my first claim, being witness to violence desensitizes us to violence. There is a French professor by the name of Youssef Hassan, and he has his doctorate in experimental social psychology. And he posted in a journal article that he gets questioned a lot on this topic by people who say, oh, I play video games and I've never been violent, and I watch superhero movies and I've never killed anybody. And he provides a good analogy for this in his article, and he says, smoking 1 cigarette a day will probably not cause lung cancer, but smoking repeatedly for days, weeks, months, and years greatly increases the risks. Similarly, playing a violent video game once will probably not cause a person to become more aggressive, but repeatedly playing violent games for days, weeks, months, and years will increase the risks. And then there was research done by 2 psychologists, L. Rule Huseman and Leonard Eron. They did a longitudinal study with 4 kids, and they followed them from the 1980s until the 2000s, and they found that the 2 children who watched many hours of violence on television when they were in elementary school tended to show higher levels of aggressive behavior when they became teenagers, as opposed to the other 2 children that they studied. They did not show as many signs of aggressive behavior as those who were exposed to violence. My second claim is Albert Bandura's social learning theory, which suggests that watching violence teaches it. Albert Bandura is currently a psychologist who is the head professor of the social science and psychology at Stanford University. And he did an experiment, which is called the Bobo doll experiment. For those of you who don't know, a Bobo doll is a giant clown doll with a weight at the bottom, so you can punch it and it'll come back to you. And he did a study involving children, and he took 3 groups. One of the groups observed an adult beating the Bobo doll, kicking it, punching it, all kinds of stuff. The other group observed them talking kindly to the doll, giving it tea, all kinds of stuff like that. And then the third group was not exposed to any of that behavior. And the results from that experiment were that children who observed the aggressive model became far more imitative of aggressive responses than those who were in the non-aggressive or the control group. And the conclusion from that is that children learn social behavior such as aggression through the process of observational learning, through watching the behavior of another person. So in other words, the more you observe this behavior, the more you are likely to act it out or imitate it. And then also in the study, he separated boys and girls, and he said that boys imitated more physically aggressive acts than girls. However, there was no difference in the verbal aggression between boys and girls, and he categorized that as a general overall aggression, being the boys might have been physically more aggressive, but the aggression levels were overall the same because of the verbal aggression used. And then my third claim is social research that suggests a line between aggressiveness and violent expectations. The first professor that I mentioned, Youssef Hassan, and his colleagues, they're psychology professors, and they published a journal article, another one, and they actually conducted an experiment where they took 70 French university students and subjected them to video games for 3 days straight. They split them into 2. The first group was subjected to all video games that were aged 18 and older, such as Call of Duty 2, Condemned, and The Club. And the other group was subjected to non-violent video games, which included Dirt 2 and Pure. And the results from that experiment were that hostile expectations and aggressive behaviors both increased over the time for the violent video game players, but not for the non-violent video game players. And the violent video game players started off with more hostile expectations than the non-violent video game players on day 1 when they learned what kind of games they were playing. And that there was absolutely no increase in aggression for the non-violent video game players. So they kind of just elaborated on the fact that the more violence you see or participate in, the more aggression you are likely to show. So In conclusion, I went over 2 studies that have been done by world-known psychologists, and yeah, so it goes to show there is a correlation between violence in the media and violence in real life.
Thank you. All right, structural stuff is pretty solid at the beginning. I think you could do a little bit more to establish the controversy, because sometimes you're talking about the video games, sometimes you're talking about other exposures to violence, like the opening attention device that you used is something that's a little bit different. I have a little bit more context to generate this. So it's not imperfect. I thought it was solid. I just think there's something that you could do that's a little bit more focused on the issue that you're talking about. A lot of the argument simply seems to be reviewing the data in these particular studies, which is not a bad thing to do, but you're making big inferences from those studies, and there's not really any degree of strength in the studies that they're reported. It's not, we get higher levels of aggression or higher levels of desensitivity, but it's not quantifiable. We're not talking about, it's not discussed how long-term it is. I think that there are some basic assumptions in the research that need to be explained a little bit more. But I thought you cited the information pretty effectively, although I do think that I'm not sure about the Bobo dolls study. I mean, you make it sound like that's a contemporary thing, and maybe there are more recent studies. Maybe he continues to use the Bobo dolls, where are you? There you go, in his research, that sort of thing. But I was hearing this argument with the Bobo dolls back in 1979 when I first started teaching. So I'm just going, okay, is this the same research? Is it updated research? I know the theory is the same. So the question is there a lot more information that supports this? This seems like it's something that's 40 plus years old. Where's the data that over the years has reinforced that particular point? It feels a little bit thin to me. I thought the generalizations were reasonable given the evidence that you had. The time was appropriate. Your exit was a little bit weaker, and you just had a tough time figuring out quite the graceful way to exit, sort of like I'm having right now. All right, thank you. And then